All right, welcome to Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet. Captain Ron is on assignment as usual. Now he's coming back next week, so get ready for that. But we have a great show for you today. We have a returning guest because he has a brand new book out, Denial of Justice, Dorothy Kilgallen, Abuse of Power, and the Most Compelling JFK Assassination Investigation in History. Just released just a few days ago, and we have Mark Shaw back with us. Mark, how you doing?
Hey, great, Tony. Thank you so much for having me back.
Well, last time, Mark, we got to know, because a lot of people really don't know or did not know much about Dorothy, and you brought this to the table.
Right.
It did very well, and even on our show, it did very well on YouTube and podcasts and all that good stuff, and people really got to know and who she was and how really she was one of the most, feared journalists, in history, because when she really put her mind to it, she made things happen and found the truth. And so if you can, just a quick summary of who she was and how she, affected the JFK assassination.
Well, that's good. A good way to start. Frankly, most people remember Dorothy Kilgallen, and so did I, from What's My Line, the successful television show on CBS in the 1950s and 60s. Every Sunday night, people watched that show. It was an intelligent quiz show. They guessed people's occupations and all of that. And there were 4 panelists and a host, but Dorothy was pretty much the star of the show, I think, kind of the prosecutor who went after the contestants to guess what their occupations were. So that's all I knew about her until I actually wrote a book about Melvin Belli, the famous lawyer in San Francisco, who
Right.
actually, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, was Jack Ruby's lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
And while interviewing one of Melvin Belli's friends, he said to me, that Belli knew Dorothy Kilgallen. And I said, from What's My Line? He said, no, Mark, you don't know anything about her. She was this fascinating woman. Yes, she was on What's My Line. She had a radio show listened to by 1 million people every day. She was syndicated her column to 200 newspapers across the country, a New York Journal-American column. And also, she was this crack investigative reporter who covered the high-profile trials of the time, including Dr. Sam Shepard, which became the Fugitive television series and movie, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, the Lenny Bruce First Amendment case, all of that.
Right.
And also, she covered the Jack Ruby trial. Jack Ruby, of course, shot Lee Harvey Oswald, so she covered that trial. And it's interesting, Mark. He said, when Dorothy died, Mr. Belli said to me, they've killed Dorothy. Now they'll go after Jack Ruby. They've killed Dorothy. Now they'll go after Jack Ruby. And so, it was that quote that I couldn't get out of my mind, Tony, and I wrote the book, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, about Dorothy. It came out early last year, and very blessed. The book became a bestseller. It really touched people's emotions. The movie rights were sold, and, I figured that I'd told everything I needed to about Dorothy Kilgallen, but bless all of the people who listen to programs like you, and bless you for having a program like this. I got all of these tips from readers that people that knew Dorothy may have known people who knew Dorothy, and talked to knew things about her death, about her JFK assassination that we'll talk about, all of that. And so I kept a file, and finally, about the middle of last year, last year, I finally figured out that I needed to write another book about Dorothy, and that's the new book you spoke about, Denial of Justice.
And it's funny, when we first talked, it was like, such compelling story and interesting facts. And it's like, oh my gosh, there's more. And so that's why I was like, I had to have you back on, because it was so interesting.
Well, thanks.
And so, well, let's start with the new book, Denial of Justice. What information did you find that made you want to write another book? Did you think that was it, the last book, and there's no more to write on, or was there still, you knew there was more stuff there even before the book was finished?
I didn't know, Tony, and you're right on point with it. I really didn't. I didn't really intend to write the first book, and I never intended to write this book, but there were some things that came to mind, both with the tips from readers and listeners and all of that made a difference. And also, it just seemed like that as time went by, my research also started to uncover facts that I didn't know much about. But there were basically 4 reasons why I wrote the new book. One was that I discovered more evidence for your listeners that didn't listen the last time. And by the way, denial of justice is for people that read the first book and didn't read the first book, so that will work. But with people who aren't familiar with Dorothy, she investigated the JFK assassination. Mm-hmm. And it was personal. She knew John Kennedy. He had befriended her young son when she took him to the White House, and so it was personal with Dorothy. And she started looking into the JFK assassination. And, to the extent that she was actually at the Jack Ruby trial, which is very important with regard to what we disclose in the new book. She interviewed Jack Ruby, the only reporter to do so. She exposed his Warren Commission testimony before it was to be released. She was on the ball, and she was investigating the Jack Kennedy assassination in 1965, and we'll get more into that. But I will tell you right now that I learned more about the fact that about that assassination, which is very important. Also, some of your listeners may remember Dorothy was actually found dead in her townhouse in November of 1965, shortly after she was telling everybody that she could find that she was going to crack the JFK assassination wide open, and it was all going to be in this book she was writing for Random House. So I found out new information about the JFK assassination that we can talk about. I found out new information about her murder, and I found out new information about the main suspect in her death, and the problems that I had with the New York District Attorney's Office investigating her death last year,
right,
without them getting into it as much as they should. So these were the kind of things that I came up with, and finally I decided a new book would be worthy.
Wow. This is why the book came out. This is why the book came out. Well, and the thing that we did not know, in I think you disclosed last time, that Dorothy didn't have a chance to really say what Jack Ruby told her. Is that correct? Or did she?
Good point. Let's just kind of go down through those things, because
please.
the four or five points there. That's important. Dorothy, obviously, your listeners may remember too. She was found dead in a townhouse, her townhouse bedroom that she never slept in, wearing clothes she never wore to bed, makeup, eyelashes, and a hairpiece on, a book on her lap, but no reading glasses. And they decided, because there was an empty Seconal bottle, sleeping pills, by the bed, that it must have been an overdose. There was absolutely no investigation. There was no evidence that Dorothy had a drug problem or was an alcoholic or anything, but the New York medical examiner, who came from the Brooklyn office, not the Manhattan office, and the Brooklyn office we found mafia controlled, as a matter of fact, just decided that it was an accidental death. But he basically said it was an accidental death, circumstances unknown, basically, that they couldn't figure out exactly what happened. It was kind of a mixed message there. But that's what happened to her. So I took the information that I had in the first book, and I started to see if I could, embellish upon that so that there could be a new standalone book that would make more sense about what really happened to Dorothy. So
right.
I had to go back. And what I did is I went back to the JFK assassination, because that was the connection we felt like with Dorothy's death. She had gotten too close to the truth. And so, whoever masterminded the assassination, and Dorothy felt like she knew who it was, she had to go ahead and take that material and throw it into this book which she was writing for Random House. And just as she had completed, I believe, a lot of that book, she was found dead. So we go back to the JFK assassination, and this is where I believe, at least, Tony, that the new book discloses for the first time in a book the most important JFK assassination documents in history. And I'm not kidding when I say that. The most important JFK assassination documents in history. And I want to just give you a brief feeling as to how I got those.
Yeah, please.
Readers, as I say, everywhere contacted me, 800 or so emails and all these people. And one night I got a call or an email and then a call from a lawyer down in Fresno, California. He said, "Mr. Shaw, I bought your book at 5 o'clock. and I read it by the time I went to bed, and I have a gift for you. And I said, well, what is that? He said, I found the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. And he said they you can actually find them in other places, but I have them, and I'm going to send you a copy of them so you can take a look. And so he did. 2,000 plus pages, Tony, of the document, the original, Jack Ruby trial transcripts from March of 1964. 2,000 plus pages. Took me about 2.5 weeks to go through them, and I found these shocking excerpts that I have included in the book. About 25 of them are in there.
Right.
And I don't know if my publisher is going to be very happy with this or not, but I actually decided I want the world to see these. So your listeners will be able to go ahead and look at markshawbooks.com, and if they scroll down a little bit, they will see a link that takes you right to these transcripts, and they're listed just like they were in the book, with commentary that I wrote based on what Dorothy had figured out with regard to the columns she'd written about the JFK assassination and all of that. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that there were some startling comments in there, startling testimony. First of all, I'm going to read something for you that it won't take but a bit of time.
Please.
It's the opening to chapter 15 in the book. And the man being testified, and remember, Dorothy is in the front row listening and watching this testimony, and there's a witness called G.C. Hallmark, the general manager of a parking lot across from where Jack Ruby's Carousel Club was. And the preliminary questions establish the parking lot, that Jack Ruby parked his car there for about 3 years. But on Saturday, the day after JFK was killed, Ruby showed up there, the testimony shows, and people can read that on page 28 of the documents, showed up there to use a pay phone. And this Hallmark testifies that he was standing right there and he was listening to what Dorothy said. And the first thing that Jack Ruby said to whoever he was talking about was that he had been making like a reporter. And what he referred to, Tony, was the night before when they had the Oswald news conference, and we have more testimony about that he basically acted like a reporter, got himself into police headquarters, got close to Henry Wade, the district attorney, introduced him to some reporters and things like that. He had a pencil and a notebook, and he had snuck in there using that, which means that obviously he was trying to find out what was happening with Oswald. So then the real startling information comes in this testimony. This guy testifies to the fact that the conversation was about the transfer of Oswald from the city to the county jail. And Ruby informed whoever he was talking to that people were trying to figure out when that was going to happen, and that it looked like, this is Ruby talking, that the transfer would be delayed. And then the question is asked, now did Ruby say anything with reference to whether or not he would be there? What did he say on that? And the answer by Mr. Hallmark is, he told whoever he was talking to that he would be there. He would be there. The answer is yes. Now, we have to remember that Ruby always told everyone that he just happened to be down by the Dallas Police Department basement, and he happened to just walk in, and Oswald just happened to walk out, and he just happened to shoot him.
Right.
Well, this destroys any possibility of that happening. Also in the testimony is the fact that there's testimony in there that he acted like a reporter with a pencil and a notebook again to get into the basement, that he used his friends in the police department to get into the basement. And the other shocking material that's in here, and then I want your reaction to this, Tony, is that there is testimony that Jack Ruby was actually at the Dallas Morning News offices at the same time that the assassination was taking place in Daley Plaza, and that Ruby stood at a window facing Daley Plaza and watched the assassination taking place.
Now this
means, of course, that he knew about the assassination before it happened. There you go.
That's major. That is major. And I'm gonna back up just a little bit.
What's your reaction to that? What is your reaction to that?
I'm not really surprised. I'm not really surprised because I've done so many shows on the JFK assassination. I'm not really surprised, but I mean, it's definitely news that I have not heard before. So, I mean, it's pretty exciting to hear the news and that pretty much everyone's suspicions are right. That this, this was not just one person, disgruntled person that gets a gun and gets up in a building and shoots. So definitely this is something that I think most people are not surprised at, but it's an exciting news that we have not heard before.
Well, what I like to do in my books is, it's one thing for me to say things. It's one thing for me to write them or even for you to say them on the air. But here's concrete proof, the transcripts. And I encourage people, again, they're on the markshawbooks.com website. Even if they don't read the books, that's up to them. But go look at these transcripts. We have the kind of the yellowed pages in there, as a matter of fact. And then the pages are also, the images are in denial of justice, so people can look at them there. And interesting, too, Tony, is that you will see Dorothy's comments that I believe she would have made based on the information that she had gotten at the trial and that she had written about in her columns. So the reaction is there, and what we know is that this is why Dorothy put herself in such danger, because she was going to include, in my opinion, what she had learned at the Ruby trial. By the way, this was never in the Warren Commission report. It wasn't in the House Select Committee on Assassinations report in the 70s. It's never been in a book before. All the people who've written about the JFK assassination, it's never been in there. And now we have this proof that there was, I don't like the word conspiracy. I like the word a plot to kill the president, because there's no question that Jack Ruby obviously knew about the assassination before it took place. And I will give you one more information, a piece of information, and that is that his lawyer, Melvin Belli, also knew before the assassination took place, because I found a witness who was with Belli in San Francisco, and a waiter came up to the table where they were having lunch and said, Mr. Belli, you may be interested, Lee Harvey Oswald was just shot. And Belli said, well, now I'll have to represent Ruby.
So, I mean,
they were all involved in this plot, and Dorothy knew all of that, and whatever Ruby told her sent her to New Orleans. We talked about this the last time, and that's where she was going to investigate Carlos Marcello, who had the strongest motive to have eliminated JFK, so Bobby Kennedy would be powerless and couldn't go after Marcello anymore. She had it all, as she told people, and she said even to one of the hairdressers in a videotaped interview that's up on the DorothyKilgallenStory.org, if the wrong people knew what I know about the JFK assassination, it would cost me my life, and she was dead shortly thereafter.
So, I mean, she's put herself in harm's way by going out on these limbs of, working with a lot of, it sounds like mob. And did she ever say to anyone, I'm scared, here's some information, hold on to this? Because, she's moving into an area that's, most people would go into this going, I could get in trouble. I can get in trouble here.
Well, Dorothy was a very courageous woman, but she wasn't real smart about the fact, the courage, first of all. I mean, she exposed Jack Ruby's testimony before the Warren Commission. That infuriated J. Edgar Hoover. All the columns she wrote, nobody else would write them, challenging his Oswald alone theory. I mean, she was the kind of woman who went after the truth. She did that in all of the cases that she covered other than the Jack Ruby case. That's the kind of woman she was, the integrity that she had. I have an incident where she refused to give the source for her how she found the Jack Ruby Warren Commission testimony. I would rather die than reveal my source. That's the kind of woman that she was. Now, she's involved in the JFK assassination. As you get to November of 1965, shortly before she died, your question is just right on. You have to wonder why, how did she feel? Did she feel like she was in danger? Well, she told one of her hairdressers, "I'm afraid for my life and my family." Okay. She bought a gun. She changed her will. So she was worried, but she couldn't keep her mouth shut. She was so excited about the fact that she was going to crack the greatest murder mystery in history, and she was going to solve that she had to talk about it. And unfortunately, Dorothy thought she was invincible, Tony. Right. She really did. And obviously she was not, because those people who couldn't let her write that book, and we can go down through how that all happened, they decided that she had to be silenced.
I would actually like us to, because even back in the day, it was rare for a woman to have this much power in journalism, for sure. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious. I'm sure if a man was in the same situation, it would have happened to him too. But can you run down some of the details about what you were just talking about? It's just fascinating, because this woman, like I said, this woman was so brave to put herself in this situation.
Not only would I suggest your listeners read the Jack Ruby trial transcripts, but also go to the DorothyKilgallenStory.org. There's a photograph in there that basically summarizes how powerful Kilgallen was. The New York Post called her the most powerful female voice in America, and you're right. It was unusual. She was a college dropout, and men ruled back then, but not Dorothy. So if you go to that website, you will see that there's a photograph at the Dr. Sam Shepard case, and all of the reporters are collected around Dorothy. They are looking at her. They're admiring her. And this was at that trial. And that's the kind of respect she had, which meant that she had the best sources. Right away, she didn't believe all this bunk about Oswald alone. She went to Dallas. She talked to the Dallas police chief, who said to her that, "Yes, you're right, Dorothy. I didn't send officers immediately after JFK was assassinated to the book depository. I sent them to the overpass." And we have confirmation of that in the new book, Denial of Justice. She had the best sources. She was at the trial. She listened to all this information, and she kept it in a JFK assassination evidence file, which disappeared when she died. But all of that had led her to realize that really what happened here, it made no sense, and in many ways it was almost like you would believe a mafia hit from The Godfather.
Right.
What happens is that you have somebody in power who is causing you problems, that is trying to deport you, that is trying to imprison you for racketeering. Well, that man was Marcello, and the person that was doing that was Bobby Kennedy. So what do? You seek revenge. And so Marcello was going to kill Bobby Kennedy, but he knew if he killed Bobby Kennedy, Jack Kennedy would come against him with everything the government had. So he had JFK killed, and Bobby Kennedy was powerless. And he did that using a person whom I believe, of course, one of them was Lee Harvey Oswald. But now Oswald gets arrested. So what are you going to do with him? Well, you've got a loose end, and you don't know what he's going to tell people, so you bring in Jack Ruby. And Jack Ruby goes ahead and takes care of Oswald, and then they bring in Melvin Belli to silence Jack Ruby. That's what Dorothy knew, in my opinion, and I think it's all confirmed in the new book, Denial of Justice. And so Dorothy then is going to put this in the new book, and there are two people who are going to be, who just can't let that happen. One of them, of course, is Marcello, because if she prints all of that material, he's going to be arrested and indicted. The other is J. Edgar Hoover, because she's proven a cover-up by Hoover, and there's going to be a grand jury, and he's going to have problems with the law. So both of those men had the motive, basically, to have silenced Kilgallen, and we know now more also about the main suspect, who actually, I believe, was complicit in Dorothy's death, and very well could have been a plant in her camp by Carlos Marcello or J. Edgar Hoover. So we can get into that as well.
Well, before we do that, I always found it fascinating because they've done this even today, where I believe that people that kill themselves or hang themselves in their cells, and they say, oh, they killed themselves, where more than likely it sounds like it could have been an inside job to where, somebody in the police department. Why do you think they did it in such a public way to kill Oswald? Because they could have just waited till he got. It didn't make sense to me.
Well, it's a good point, but he's a loose end, and so Dorothy had connected Oswald to Marcello, and so have I done that in both books. I don't think that was hard to do at all. So of course he's going to, if they put him to the test, he may have implicated Marcello.
Got it.
So you can't let him do that.
They had to get him as soon as possible.
Right. So you could try to do something with him at the county jail, but they probably couldn't have done that with the security. So the next thing is this stupid public transfer from the city to the county jail. And that gave them the opportunity that they needed. Connecting Marcello to Ruby is really easy if people would have been paying attention, and Dorothy did. The first visitor to Jack Ruby in jail, Tony, was Joseph Cenero, and he was an underling of Marcello's in Dallas. And there's no question in my mind that he visited Ruby and said, hey, keep your mouth shut, don't say anything, we've got a big-time lawyer coming who's going to help you, and that was Belli, of course, and so they sealed up that situation as well. So it's a lot of common sense here, but based on, actual documents like the Jack Ruby trial transcripts.
And when they released a lot of the JFK information here recently, not too long ago, was any of this information, did it match up with some of what Dorothy had put together, or no? Was there nothing in connection with her?
Yeah, there's it's disappointing that they didn't release more, and I don't know why they're trying to hide these things, but there were a couple pieces of evidence in there that were important. There was a document that they released that J. Edgar Hoover had sent a memo within hours of JFK being killed to the Justice Department.
Right.
And it said something, and I'm summarizing just a bit. We must convince the American public that Lee Harvey Oswald was the only assassin of JFK. That connects with what Dorothy, was alleging that, that didn't make any sense to her at all.
Mm.
So she put that kind of thing in her columns and everything else that way. And it's important because people wonder, why did J. Edgar Hoover do this? Well, if it was a nut, then there's nothing the FBI or anybody else could have done. If there's a plot to kill the president, however, then the FBI is responsible.
Right.
So J. Edgar Hoover was protecting himself, Tony, by throwing out that Oswald alone theory, and frankly, it brainwashed everybody but Dorothy Kilgallen.
Wow.
It brainwashed the American public. It brainwashed the Warren Commission. And also, I have a spiral notebook that was kept by one of the jurors in the Ruby trial, and it's in the new book. And basically, it shows that on the day that this damning testimony I gave to you about Ruby, asking about the transfer of Oswald and saying he would be there, there's nothing in there about that. So the jury wasn't paying attention either to this kind of information. We also looked at the newspapers of the time, a researcher did, and there's nothing in there about that. People just missed all that because J. Edgar Hoover was sending them down a one-way street with all of that information, and here's Dorothy going what really was the wrong way on the one-way street, but it was the right way because she was revealing the cover-up.
And I'm surprised also, did Dorothy, because a lot of people have, at that status, have people that they work with, assistants and personnel.
Mm-hmm.
Did she have people that she worked with that where they may have had some of the information that or did she keep everything to herself? Did she do this alone? Because I couldn't imagine she would just...
Well, people have asked me that, and I can tell you, no, she did not share this information with anyone except that, and this moves us on to now this snitch, this Judas, who was in Dorothy's camp, a guy named Ron Pataki. He is an interesting figure. He was a Midwestern journalist. And he kind of conveniently came into Dorothy's life. He was much younger than she was, and they had a love affair. And Dorothy trusted him and gave him a lot of the information that she had found out about the JFK assassination. And, I've interviewed him several times and pinpointed him as the person who I believe was responsible for leaking that material to the wrong people. She suspected that was happening right before she died, and this will move us into the New York District Attorney's investigation. But Pataki was somebody who was in a position to have leaked that information. There was nobody else. She did not share that information with anyone else, so he's the only one who could have done that. And we're able to show in both The Reporter Who Knew Too Much and in Denial of Justice that there's no doubt that he was with her the night before she died at the Regency Hotel. And even in the new book, I've been able to interview members of his family who say that Pataki told them he was the last person to see her alive, that the poems he wrote about her had information in them, facts in them that only the killer could have known. So there's no question in my mind that he was complicit in her death and was responsible for poisoning the drink that she had at the Regency Hotel or where she died at home. 3 barbiturates, not 1.
Dang, that's a lot.
So Pataki's a bad guy, and I asked that he be investigated by Cyrus Vance Jr., the New York DA, last year, and I can give you the details of what happened there.
Yeah, tell me about that. We can't end it right there.
Well, at the beginning of last year, against all odds, I asked the New York District Attorney's Office to investigate Dorothy's death. And lo and behold, they said they would. There was a New York Post article about it that came out, and this is what skyrocketed the book into bestseller status and all of that, because people were excited, as I was, that there was going to be an investigation. Well, for 8 months, I gave every piece of evidence I had to the New York District Attorney's Office, their main investigator and all of that, emails back and forth, and in June of last year, I met with him in New York and gave him a 25-page evidence report with all of the facts about Dorothy's death, a long list of witnesses, documents that needed to be looked into, and he was so excited. We mostly handle embezzlement cases here. Everybody's excited, and I've sent out subpoenas already, and all of that. And one point that he made right away, he said, having read the book, I wonder if Ron Pataki leaked her information and who he gave it to. Maybe he sold it to someone. So, Tony, I was on cloud 9, so to speak. She was finally going to get the investigation that she deserved.
That's great.
And they were going to interview Pataki and all of that. But in August of last year, I had a phone call with the chief investigator Ramos and an assistant district attorney named Hurley. And right away, I could tell that by the tone that something was wrong. And Hurley said to me, "Listen, Mr. Shaw, we've done a thorough investigation for 8 months, and we can't find any evidence that Dorothy Kilgallen was harmed by the actions of others. In other words, that she was murdered." And I said, "What?" And he said, "No, Mr. Shaw." And I said, "Well, what about all the evidence that I've given you? I gave you information that Dorothy's daughter said my mother was murdered. giving you all those facts and all of this evidence and the witnesses and everything. Well, Mr. Shaw, we are not going to argue with you, and we don't know who did it. Well, that's a completely contradictory comment if you didn't believe anybody harmed her. But they then slammed the door on the investigation, issued a press release, and all of that, and I was just flabbergasted and disappointed that there was an obstruction of justice in my mind, because I contacted the witnesses. I had given them 5 or 6 of them right away by email, and none of them had been interviewed. They had not looked for the documents. They had done nothing at all and just basically closed the investigation. So one of the things that happened in the middle of last year is that I started to come up with new evidence, because they made a promise that if I came up with new evidence, they would reopen the investigation, Tony. And last Friday, I sent about a 22 or 23-page letter to Cyrus Vance Jr. asking him to keep his promise based on all of the new evidence that I have presented in denial of justice. People can read that letter on the DorothyKilgallenStory.org. I set out all of the reasons why we need the investigation and asked that they do a grand jury investigation of Dorothy's death. And so I'm not going to give up on this. I'm her voice, and I'm going to keep battling for her to get the justice she deserves.
I mean, yeah, I totally agree that you can't give up on this, because this lady, amazing lady, put her neck on the line to, this was her passion too, but to actually find some answers of the biggest murder mystery in American history. So besides, Abraham Lincoln, but we know who did that, at least the majority of them who did that. So, I mean, this.
Yeah, if I may, because you've made such a good point. Think about what would have happened if Dorothy hadn't died.
Oh my gosh.
She would have published that book. There would have been no JFK greatest murder mystery in history.
Right.
It wouldn't have happened. I have no doubt that both J. Edgar Hoover and Carlos Marcello would have been indicted, and the whole thing, the truth would have come out.
And are you?
They couldn't let her do that. They couldn't let her do that.
And I mean, to this day, like you said, they're still fighting to get the answers, to the public. And I'm surprised that you're not having I guess you are. You're showing that you're having problems trying to get some answers, but you've pushed and you've learned so much to create 2 books with some great information. Have you had any resistance other than that particular situation, or because the mob is still the mob and the government's still the government?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and it's a good question again. Thank you. The book is still set up like the first one was, as a true crime murder mystery, so people can make up their own mind about what happened to Dorothy. That's what I like to do. I want people to stop and think and make up their own mind. They can look at the Jack Ruby trial transcripts on my website, markshawbooks.com. They can make up their mind about the letter that's on the DorothyKilgallenStory.org. But yes, there's resistance everywhere, and I'll tell you where much of it has come from that's really disappointing. Nobody stood up for Dorothy when she died.
Right.
She had no track record of being a drug addict or an alcoholic. Her parents didn't stand up for her kids, What's My Line colleagues, journalists. Nobody stood up for Dorothy at that time. They just accepted the fact that she had died of an overdose of drugs and alcohol. Well, I hadn't learned some of the I had speculation about that for a while, but I found Dorothy Kilgallen's butler's daughter, and I interviewed her last summer in New York City. And she told me things about Dorothy's, the inside story of Dorothy's the townhouse, because she and the butler and her mother, they all lived in the townhouse, so they knew all this. She told me about the party. She told me about Dorothy's celebrities that she knew that came there, Dorothy's shoe collection, all these things. But she also said some things about, the fact that there was no question, everybody knew that she was chasing the JFK assassination, that her father warned her about danger, that the hairdressers warned her about the danger, all of that.
Right.
And so, cut to, 2 years ago or 3 years ago when I started writing The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, I was able to find cousins of Dorothy's. I was able to find Dorothy's sister's daughter. I was able to track down those people. Recently, I found 2 other cousins.
Wow.
All of them
Amazing.
have refused to cooperate with what I'm doing, including her children.
Still.
And God knows why. They didn't help in 1965, and now they won't help now. Some of them say they're scared. They're private people. They just want to leave this alone. I mean, I have done everything I can to reinstate Dorothy's reputation. You would think that they would be thankful for that and would want to give me whatever help I could have, I could use.
Right.
I even asked 2 cousins to support the letter that I sent to Vance Jr. Last Friday. Frank O'Connor on the East Coast and Chris Pryor in Topeka, Kansas. And they both initially told me that they would do that, and then they changed their mind. So yes, I've run into those obstacles, and there's nothing I can do about that. So I just accept it and I keep moving on. But it's disappointing that even this 53 years later, whatever it is, that Dorothy Kilgallen's family won't stand up and try to help us find the truth about what happened to her.
I just recently lost my mother. I couldn't imagine.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. But I couldn't imagine, the love that I had for my mother, that if somebody came to me and said, can you, verify this to pretty much validate her. I mean, I wouldn't even take me but 2 seconds to say yes. So it is a little baffling that, maybe cousins, okay, but your children, then that makes you wonder why they still are denying it.
Here's another one for you that's kind of mind-boggling. I recently heard an account of the show, the What's My Line show, the first one that was aired on CBS after Dorothy died. And they have 4 panelists on there. They have Arlene Francis, they have Steve Allen, they have Fred Allen, and they have Bennett Cerf, who was her editor at Random House. And they all have absolutely just lavished Dorothy with compliments, how great she was. Bennett Cerf says, there was she was a hard-edged questioner on What's My Line, but she was the warmest person, and she was this, and she was that, and, she was insightful, and she was so intelligent, and they just praise her up one side and down the other. And then these are the same 4 people, along with John Daly, who was the moderator, who never stood up for Dorothy at all.
Oh, man.
They somehow or another, in their own mind, whether they were scared or not, they wouldn't go to bat for Dorothy Kilgallen and try to say, wait, there needs to be an investigation here, and we need to find the truth. They all kept quiet. They all just went on their way. They all just, in my opinion, betrayed Dorothy.
Well, because of time, we only have about 5 minutes left. I want to make sure we hit on all points with the new book, and I want everybody to know we're talking to Mark Shaw. He has a book out called Denial of Justice, Dorothy Kilgallen, Abuse of Power, and the Most Compelling JFK Assassination Investigation in History, and we've been going over some of the details that he has discovered since his first book, and that we had him on for, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. And with the power that the government has, and then also especially back then, the mob was they did a lot of hitmans at that time. So, and I'm sure they still do in their own different ways. But what other things that we can learn from Denial of Justice that we haven't discussed yet? Because there's so much about this amazing woman that people did not know. We know now, but there's constantly things coming out to this day.
Yeah. Well, with Dorothy, she just would not accept an answer if she had any suspicion about it. Hopefully she's the inspiration, the role model for asking questions.
Right.
People need to ask questions about why those JFK documents required by law to be released last fall weren't released. They need to, we need to know answers to things that our government is doing, especially when it has anything to do with government corruption.
Mm-hmm.
I think we find with most investigations of government corruption, they never usually find the evidence that we believe is just obvious. And it's the same situation with whether it's Cyrus Vance Jr. or the Warren Commission or, any of these committees, congressional committees, whatever it is. You've got to be suspicious of whether or not they are really actually after the truth or not, or whether they're trying to protect people. I heard the other day that with regard to the non-disclosure of the JFK documents,
Mm-hmm.
that they're talking about national security, but also that there's some belief, at least, that one of the Bush family may have been in Dallas when JFK was assassinated, and they're trying to protect the fact that there could be some allegations of impropriety on his part. So they'll use basically any excuse that they can to not give us the truth, and that's not transparency in government. That's not how it's supposed to look or how it's supposed to work. I mean, you look at the Vance Jr. Their investigation. They just decided, and I'm not so sure that they haven't actually found Dorothy Kilgallen's JFK assassination evidence file. A source close to the office told me that they did, so I'm still trying to look into that and see if that's true. But if that's true, then it's even more of an obstruction of justice, because if we could find Dorothy Kilgallen's file, it would really be important history-wise. And the other thing I would like to say is that be careful when you read these books that authors or these columns that people write about things if they weren't there. And I would say be suspicious of even myself. When I write about those things, I try to do what I can, not speculate, primary sources, videotaped interviews, and all of that. But you're not going to find Dorothy Kilgallen's name in any of the JFK Assassination's books. Nobody has ever wanted to include her in the research, and you're certainly not going to find the Jack Ruby transcripts, which I believe, as I said, are the most important JFK assassination documents in history.
Yeah, I think there has to. Because it's hard to believe that a journalist would keep all her information in one spot, especially as somebody of her status.
Well, you couldn't go to Kinko's then, Tony.
Yeah, that's true.
Really, and they just what did they do?
True.
They just used carbons, remember?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that was it.
Well, as always, you are so fascinating. Thank you for doing the research. Thank you for doing what you do. This keeps this going because they want us to forget. They want us to not, they just want us to accept what they say. And people like you and me and many others, until we see the proof, until we see exactly what happens, we're not going to stop until the truth comes out.
Well, I applaud you for your show, and I would say if any of the listeners have any information about Dorothy or whatever, please get in touch with me, markshawbooks.com, or my website. There's email and all of that. So I thank you for doing what you do as well, Tony.
Oh, you're welcome. And please pick up the book. You can go to his website, markshawbooks.com, or you can go to Amazon, and I'm sure there's many other places that you can pick it up. But thank you so much, Mark.
Absolutely.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning
All
in.
right.
Once again, for Truth Be Told, I'm Tony Sweet, and next time we'll have more information on some very interesting subjects for you. All right, until then, bye-bye.